The village of Mwando buzzed with excitement as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson. Tonight was a special night, a night of joy and celebration. Kamari, the village's strongest and most skilled blacksmith, and his wife Ayana, a gifted healer known for her kindness and wisdom, were celebrating their 5th wedding anniversary. Their love was admired by all, a symbol of unity and strength. The villagers gathered in the open clearing, where long wooden tables were lined with roasted meats, steaming pots of stew, and baskets overflowing with fresh fruit. Children ran barefoot through the grass, their laughter echoing in the warm evening air. Drummers sat near the center, tapping out a rhythmic beat that made hearts race and feet move. The scent of burning incense and spiced wine filled the air, adding to the magic of the night. Kamari stood tall, his muscular frame illuminated by the flickering torches. He greeted friends and family with a wide grin, his deep laughter carrying across the crowd. He was a man of great strength, his hands calloused from years of forging iron, yet his touch was always gentle with Ayana. She, in turn, was the heart of their home, a woman with a soft voice, but a powerful presence. Her ability to heal the sick and wounded had saved countless lives, and her wisdom was sought after by many. Together, they were the perfect pair, a couple that others envied and admired. As the evening progressed, villagers took turns sharing stories of the couple's love. An elder woman recalled the day Kamari had first laid eyes on Ayana, how he had spent months crafting the most beautiful necklace of silver and blue stones just to win her heart. Another spoke of how Ayana had nursed Kamari back to health after he was injured in a terrible accident at the forge. Their love was not just made of words, it was built on actions, on sacrifices, on unbreakable trust. Music filled the air as the feast continued, and soon the dancing began. Kamari pulled Ayana into his arms, twirling her under the moonlight. Her laughter was soft, like a melody only he could hear. They moved together effortlessly, lost in each other, oblivious to the world around them. The villagers clapped and cheered, celebrating not just their anniversary, but the kind of love that felt timeless. But beneath the surface of all the joy and admiration, something stirred, something small, almost invisible, yet dangerous. Kamari had been drinking more than usual. His normally warm gaze held a slight edge, his grip on Ayana's waist tightening just a little too much as they danced. No one noticed it yet, not even Ayana, but the night was far from over, and what was meant to be a celebration would soon turn into something no one could have predicted. The drums pounded louder, the rhythm pulsing through the night like a heartbeat. Laughter and cheers filled the air as the villagers danced, their feet kicking up dust under the bright moonlight. The feast was in full swing, and the scent of roasted meat and sweet fruit lingered in the warm evening breeze. Kamari sat at the center of it all, a wide grin on his face, his cup overflowing with palm wine. He had been drinking since the sun dipped below the horizon, his deep laughter growing louder with each passing hour. His arm was draped lazily around Ayana, his beloved wife, who smiled politely but kept glancing at him with concern. At first, no one noticed the shift. Kamari, the strong and cheerful blacksmith, was a man who loved to celebrate, and tonight was his night. But there was something different about him, something slightly off. His words, once smooth and charming, were beginning to slur. His grip on Ayana's arm tightened just a little too much. His laughter, once warm and inviting, now carried an unfamiliar sharpness. Ayana's smile faded as she gently tried to pull away, but Kamari held on. Then it happened. It started as a simple misunderstanding, a small comment whispered between them. No one knew exactly what was said, but suddenly Kamari's expression darkened. His eyes, once filled with love, flashed with something dangerous. Ayana's lips parted in surprise, her brow furrowing as she tried to calm him, but he wasn't listening. His jaw clenched, his breathing heavy. The festive air around them seemed to shift, the laughter fading as those nearby sensed the change. "Ayana," he growled, his voice low but sharp. "Don't talk to me like that." Ayana's face remained calm, her voice steady. "Kamari, you're drunk. Let's talk in the morning." But her attempt to soothe him only made it worse. His hand clenched into a fist, his body tensed. The world around them slowed as he suddenly lifted his hand. Before anyone could react, his palm met Ayana's cheek with a loud, sharp crack. The music stopped. The laughter died. Gasps of horror rippled through the crowd. A child dropped a piece of fruit, the soft thud lost in the stunned silence. Women covered their mouths in shock, while men froze in place, unsure of what they had just witnessed. The night, once filled with joy, had turned into something cold and ugly. Ayana didn't cry out. She didn't stumble or run. She simply stood there, her head turned to the side, her cheek burning from the force of the slap. The entire village watched, waiting for her to react, waiting for her to scream, to fight back, to do something, but she didn't. Slowly, Ayana turned her face back to Kamari, her eyes locking onto his. There was no anger in them, no fear, only something deep and unreadable. Kamari, breathing heavily, blinked, his expression unreadable. The realization of what he had done seemed to settle on his face, but it was too late. The damage was done. A single tear slid down Ayana's cheek, not from pain, but from something far worse. Betrayal. Without a word, she stepped back, 1 step, 2. Then, as if the weight of the moment was too heavy for the air around her, she turned and walked away. Not fast, not slow, just steady. The villagers stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Should they stop her? Should they confront Kamari? Whispers began to rise, hushed voices filled with disbelief and anger. No one had ever seen Kamari raise a hand against his wife. No one thought he ever would. But now, nothing would ever be the same again. The silence was deafening. The entire village stood frozen, eyes locked on Ayana. The sting of the slap still lingered in the air, hanging like a dark cloud over the once festive night. The drums had stopped. The laughter had died. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. All eyes were on her, waiting for her to scream, to cry, to lash out. But she did none of those things. She didn't stumble. She didn't clutch her cheek. She didn't shed a single tear. Instead, she stood perfectly still, her expression unreadable, her dark eyes fixed on Kamari. He was breathing heavily, his fists still clenched, his face twisted with the remnants of drunken anger. But something in her gaze made him uneasy. This wasn't the look of a broken woman. This wasn't fear. It wasn't even sadness. It was something else, something deeper, something colder. The villagers shifted uncomfortably, exchanging nervous glances. They had seen men lose control before, had seen arguments turn violent, but they had never seen a woman react like this. No begging, no shouting, no running, just silence. Then Ayana took a slow step forward. Her shadow stretched beneath the flickering torchlight, growing longer, darker. Kamari's breath hitched in his throat, his body suddenly tense. The wine in his system was beginning to fade, but it was too late now. Too late to take it back. She leaned in just slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You have no idea what you've done." Her words weren't a threat. They weren't a plea. They were a simple, undeniable truth. A truth Kamari didn't yet understand. And then, without another word, she turned around and walked away. No one dared to stop her. The villagers parted like water, stepping aside as she moved through the crowd, her head held high. The light from the torches flickered against her skin, but she didn't look back, didn't hesitate. Her dress swayed gently with each step. The only movement in the paralyzed village square. The night swallowed her whole. Kamari stood rooted in place, his hands shaking now. He wanted to call after her, to reach out to fix what had just happened, but his voice failed him. His feet refused to move. He had seen Ayana upset before. He had seen her angry, but he had never seen her like this. A cold dread crept up his spine. He didn't know why, but something told him, something deep in his bones, that this was only the beginning. When the first light of dawn stretched across the village of Mwando, the air was thick with an uneasy silence. Birds chirped lazily in the trees. The river hummed softly in the distance, and the scent of last night's feast still lingered. But something was missing. Someone was missing. Kamari woke with a pounding headache, his mouth dry, his thoughts clouded. The events of the night before clashed in his mind like broken pieces of a dream. The celebration, the laughter, the wine, then the argument, the slap, the look in Ayana's eyes before she walked away. A sick feeling coiled in his stomach. He turned over in bed, reaching for her, expecting warmth, expecting forgiveness, expecting to find her there. But the bed was cold, empty. His heart stumbled over itself as he sat up, glancing around their small home. Her woven shawl still hung on the wooden hook near the door. Her clay pots of herbal medicines lined the shelves, but Ayana was nowhere to be seen. Kamari pushed the door open, stepping outside, the cool morning air hitting his face. He scanned the village square. Women were already up, carrying baskets on their heads, whispering to one another. Children ran barefoot through the dusty path, chasing each other with carefree laughter. Everything looked normal, except it wasn't. Something felt wrong. His neighbor, an elderly man named Django, noticed him and shuffled over. "You're up late, Kamari. Where's Ayana?" Kamari swallowed. She didn't come home last night." Django frowned. "Did she stay with her sister?" Kamari's chest tightened. That had been his first thought too. But Ayana's sister, Sefu, lived just on the other side of the village. If she had stayed there, someone would have seen her return by now. Word spread quickly. The villagers paused their morning routines, concern growing. A group of women checked the healer's hut. Her supplies were untouched. A few men went to the riverbank, searching for footprints. Others combed through the fields, calling her name. But there was nothing. No sign, no clues, no answers. It was as if Ayana had vanished into thin air. Kamari's hands curled into fists. This wasn't right. This wasn't normal. Ayana was strong, independent, but she would never disappear like this. Not without telling someone. Not without a trace. The villagers whispered amongst themselves, their voices laced with worry and something else, something colder, fear, because deep down they all felt it. This wasn't just a woman leaving her home. This was something much, much bigger. Kamari jolted awake, his body drenched in sweat. A sharp, burning pain shot through his hands, forcing a strangled cry from his throat. He clutched them to his chest, his fingers trembling violently. It felt as though fire had been poured over his skin, searing deep into his flesh. The pain was unbearable, like unseen flames licking at his bones. He forced himself to sit up, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The small hut was still shrouded in darkness, the first rays of dawn barely creeping through the wooden slats. He glanced down at his hands, expecting to see burns, cuts, something to explain the agony, but his skin was unmarked. No wounds, no bruises, nothing, yet the pain was real. Gritting his teeth, he stumbled out of bed, his legs shaky beneath him. The world outside was eerily quiet. The usual sounds of the morning, birds chirping, villagers chatting, the distant laughter of children, were missing. A strange heaviness settled over everything, as if the village itself was holding its breath. Kamari staggered toward the well, his hands still throbbing. He needed water. He needed something to cool the invisible fire scorching his flesh. As he approached, he saw a group of villagers gathered around the well, whispering in hushed, anxious tones. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with unease. Django, the elder, turned as Kamari approached. "Something is wrong," he muttered, his voice laced with fear. Kamari frowned. "What do you mean?" One of the women stepped forward, her face troubled. "The well, it's dry." His stomach dropped. That wasn't possible. The well had never dried up. Even in the harshest seasons, its waters had never failed them. He pushed past the crowd and peered inside. A pit of emptiness stared back at him. No water, just dry, cracked earth at the bottom. A shiver ran down his spine. The whispers grew louder. "This has never happened before. What if it's a sign? What if we are cursed?" Kamari turned away from the well, his heart pounding. He needed to clear his mind. Maybe it was just a bad season, a coincidence. He needed to see for himself. He hurried toward the fields, ignoring the pain in his hands, his breath shallow. But as soon as he reached the crops, he froze. The once lush green fields were changing before his eyes. The leaves of the maize plants curled inward, their vibrant colour fading to a sickly yellow. The yam vines sagged, their roots exposed like twisted fingers grasping at dry soil. The earth itself seemed to be rejecting life. A farmer rushed past him, heading toward his livestock pen. A group of villagers followed, their movements quick and desperate. Kamari forced his legs to move, dread coiling in his chest as he followed them. What he saw made his blood run cold. The cattle stood motionless, their heads bowed, their ribs more pronounced than they had been the day before. Goats bleated weakly, barely nibbling at the hay scattered in their pens. Even the chickens, usually full of energy, remained still, their eyes dull and lifeless. "They won't eat," one of the farmers said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They refuse to drink. They just stand there." The fear in the air was thick, suffocating. The elders gathered quickly, their faces lined with worry. Django, his usual calm demeanor replaced by unease, spoke in a low voice. "This is not natural. A well drying up overnight, crops withering in hours, animals refusing to eat. This is a curse." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "But why?" someone asked. The answer hung heavy in the silence. No one wanted to say it, but they were all thinking it. Ayana. She had disappeared without a trace, leaving only an unsettling stillness in her wake. And now, the village itself was suffering. Kamari's hands throbbed again, a fresh wave of pain shooting through his fingers. He clenched his fists, his heart hammering against his ribs. This wasn't just a coincidence. Something was happening, something unexplainable. And deep down, Kamari knew this was only the beginning. Kamari could no longer ignore the truth. The village was suffering, and so was he. His hands still burned with an invisible fire, and the pain had only worsened. Every breath he took felt heavier, like the very air around him was punishing him. He knew the elders were right. This was no ordinary misfortune. This was something deeper, something unnatural, and he knew exactly where it had begun, with Ayana. She had disappeared, and now everything was falling apart. The well was dry, the crops were dying, and the animals refused to eat. The people whispered in fear, avoiding his eyes. Though no one said it aloud, he could feel their silent accusations. He was the last one to see her. He was the one who had wronged her, and now the village was paying the price. He couldn't stay here and watch everything crumble. There was only one choice left. He had to find Ayana. Without another word, Kamari grabbed a small satchel, filling it with whatever food and water he could find. The villagers watched as he moved with quiet urgency, but no one stopped him. Some whispered prayers under their breath. Others simply turned away, afraid of what might come next. His heart pounded as he stepped beyond the edge of the village, following a path that had not been walked in years. The elders called it the Forbidden Forest, a place where the trees grew impossibly tall, and the air always felt colder, even in the heat of the sun. It was a place of spirits, of things unseen. No one entered unless they had no other choice, and Kamari had no other choice. The moment he crossed the threshold, an eerie silence fell around him. The birds stopped singing, the rustling leaves stilled. The world itself seemed to be watching. He pushed forward, his footsteps crunching against the dry leaves, his breath coming in short gasps. Shadows stretched between the towering trees, twisting and shifting as if alive. The deeper he went, the heavier the air became, pressing against his chest like an unseen force. Then he heard it, a whisper, soft, barely there, like wind through the trees. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but then it came again, closer, more distinct. Kamari. His blood ran cold. His name. Someone was calling his name. He spun around, but there was no one. Just trees, just darkness. His fingers twitched. His hands throbbed. The pain pulsed like a heartbeat, urging him forward. He swallowed hard and kept moving. The whispers grew louder. Not just one voice now, many. Some were distant, others right behind him. Some sounded like Ayana, others did not. Find her. Keep going. You have no idea what you've done. Kamari gritted his teeth, pushing down the fear that clawed at his chest. He didn't understand what was happening, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He had to find Ayana. And then, through the thick mist that had started to form around him, he saw it, a faint glow, soft blue light, pulsing like a heartbeat deep within the trees. His breath hitched. Something was waiting for him, and he knew This was where he would find his wife. Kamari's breath came in ragged gasps as he pushed through the thick mist, his body tense, his heart hammering against his ribs. The strange blue light ahead pulsed softly, illuminating the trees with an otherworldly glow. The whispers that had guided him through the forbidden forest had faded, replaced by an eerie stillness. Then, the trees opened up, and he stepped into a place unlike anything he had ever seen. A hidden valley stretched before him, bathed in a soft, ethereal light. At its center was a glowing pool of water, shimmering like liquid moonlight. The air felt different here, heavier, charged with something ancient and powerful. The ground beneath his feet hummed with energy, sending chills through his body. And then he saw her, Ayana. She stood at the edge of the pool, her bare feet touching the glowing water, her back to him. But something about her was different. The woman he had known, the kind, gentle healer, was gone. In her place stood someone more. Her presence was commanding, almost overwhelming. It was as if the air itself bent around her, recognizing her as something greater than human. Kamari took a shaky step forward. Ayana. She turned slowly, and the moment their eyes met, his knees nearly buckled. Her gaze burned into him, not with anger, but with something deeper, something ancient, something beyond human understanding. He had never feared his wife before, but now, standing before her, he felt like a man who had trespassed into a place he did not belong. Ayana's voice was calm, steady, but it carried a weight that sent shivers down his spine. "You broke something sacred," she said, her words sinking into him like stones in deep water. Kamari swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Ayana, She raised a hand and he fell silent. The pool behind her pulsed, and suddenly, Kamari felt the pain in his hands intensify. He clenched his fists, groaning as the unseen fire burned hotter, searing into his bones. He dropped to his knees, panting. Ayana stepped closer, her gaze never leaving his. "When you raised your hand against me, you did more than hurt your wife," she said. "You disrupted the balance. Love, trust, harmony, they are sacred. When you struck me, you shattered something beyond what you can see." Kamari's breath hitched, the well drying up, the crops withering, the livestock refusing to eat. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't just misfortune. It was because of him. He had broken something, and now the village was paying the price. Ayana knelt before him, her face unreadable. "Now, you must prove you can fix it." Kamari looked up at her, desperation in his eyes. "How?" he whispered. Ayana didn't answer immediately. Instead, she placed her hand over his, and for the first time since he had entered the valley, the burning pain in his hands lessened. A strange warmth spread through him, not of fire, but of something else, something healing. She studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, she spoke. "Stand, Kamari," she commanded. "Your test begins now." Ayana's words echoed in his mind, filling him with a sense of dread and determination. He had broken something sacred, and now he had to prove he could fix it. But how? Ayana extended her hand toward the glowing pool. The water rippled, and suddenly the landscape around them shifted. The valley blurred, and when the air settled again, Kamari found himself standing before a river unlike any he had ever seen. Its surface was unnaturally still, like glass, reflecting everything above it with eerie clarity. Ayana's voice rang out, calm yet firm. "Your first trial, the river of reflection." Kamari stepped closer, peering into the water. Instead of his usual reflection, he saw something else, himself, but distorted. His face twisted in anger, his hands clenched into fists. He saw the moment he had struck Ayana, the rage in his eyes, the shock on her face. The water shimmered, showing him more. Other times he had let his anger control him, moments he had ignored, buried deep within himself. His stomach twisted. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. The water forced him to face the truth. The violence wasn't just in that one moment. It had always been there, lurking beneath the surface. The river pulsed, and suddenly a voice, his own, spoke from the water. "Do you see yourself now?" Kamari's hands curled into fists, but he forced himself to release them. He swallowed hard and whispered, "Yes." The river shimmered, and the distorted reflection faded. The trial was over. Before he could catch his breath, The world around him shifted again. Now, he stood in a vast clearing, the air thick with heat. A screech pierced the silence, and from the sky, a creature descended, a firebird, its feathers blazing with golden flames. Its eyes locked onto him, filled with wild fury. Ayana's voice echoed again. Your second trial. Tame the firebird. The massive bird flapped its wings, sending a wave of heat toward him. Kamari shielded his face, sweat dripping down his brow. He knew this wasn't a battle of strength. He couldn't force the bird to obey. He had to earn its trust. He took a slow step forward, keeping his hands open. I mean no harm, he said, his voice steady. The firebird screeched again, flames bursting from its wings. It didn't believe him. Kamari closed his eyes, forcing himself to calm his racing heart. He thought of Ayana, the way she healed with kindness, not force, the way she looked at the world with patience, not anger. If he wanted to tame the firebird, he had to let go of his own darkness. He exhaled and opened his eyes, this time with no fear. I am not my anger, he said softly. I am not my past. The firebird stilled. Its flames flickered, no longer wild and threatening. Slowly, it lowered its head. Kamari reached out and touched its feathers. The fire did not burn him. Instead, warmth spread through his body, not painful, but cleansing. The firebird let out a soft cry before taking off into the sky, disappearing in a trail of golden light. The ground shifted again. Now, Kamari stood before a massive stone, impossibly heavy. Ayana stood beside it, watching him with knowing eyes. Your final trial, she said. Carry the weight of your actions. Kamari hesitated, then bent down and gripped the stone. The moment his hands touched it, a crushing weight pressed down on him, heavier than anything he had ever carried. It wasn't just stone. It was every lie he had told himself, every excuse, every time he had refused to take responsibility. His legs shook. His arms screamed in pain. He wanted to drop it, but he knew that would mean failure. He gritted. The ground beneath him felt unsteady, as if the very earth had shifted beneath his feet. Every muscle in his body ached. His breath came in short gasps, and his hands, once filled with strength, now trembled at his sides. The trials had taken everything from him. He had been pushed to his limit, forced to face himself in ways he never had before. And yet, despite the exhaustion, something inside him felt lighter, different. A figure stood before him, silent, watching. There was no anger in her gaze, no warmth either, only quiet observation. The question hung between them, unspoken but heavy. Had he truly changed? He wanted to say yes. He wanted to believe that enduring the trials had transformed him into a better man, that he was no longer the person who had let anger consume him. But deep down, he knew the truth. Change was not instant. It was not a single moment of revelation. It was a choice, one that had to be made again and again. A deep breath steadied his voice. Not yet, he admitted. The figure did not look surprised. She tilted her head slightly, as if waiting for more. The anger is still there, he continued, his voice hoarse but steady. I can feel it, waiting in the shadows, but I see it now. I understand it, and I know that I cannot let it control me. A long silence stretched between them. Then, a soft touch. Fingertips pressed lightly against his chest, right over his heart. A warmth spread through him, but unlike the fire that had burned him before, this was different, gentle, healing. The first step has been taken, she murmured, but the path ahead is long. The trials are not over. His breath hitched. He knew she was right. Surviving the tests had not erased the past. It had not undone the pain he had caused. There were still those who feared him, who saw only the man who had raised his hand in anger. If he was to prove himself, it would not be through words, but through his actions. His gaze lifted, steady and sure. Will you walk with me? The question lingered, hanging in the air between them. No immediate answer came. Instead, she turned toward the glowing pool, its light beginning to fade. The sacred valley around them blurred, shifting, dissolving back into the dark embrace of the forbidden forest. And then, without a word, she stepped forward. He followed. The air around her felt different now, charged with something unseen yet powerful. Whispers curled through the wind, voices that did not belong to the living. They spoke only to her, unseen but ever present, waiting for her decision. He stood before her, weary, humbled, and changed, perhaps. The trials had tested him, stripped him bare, forcing him to confront the darkness within. But had they truly reshaped him? Could a man who had once let his anger control him be trusted to never do so again? The spirits had given her two choices. Take him back, forgive, allow him the chance to prove that he was no longer the man who had shattered what was once whole, or turn away, leave him to bear the weight of his own actions, to carry the burden of loss as she had carried the pain of his betrayal. Her fingers curled at her sides. She had loved him once, with a heart full of trust, with hands that healed and never harmed. That love had been pure, untainted, until the night he had lifted his hand against her. That night had changed everything. His voice broke the silence. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. He did not beg. He did not plead. He only spoke the truth. I know my words mean nothing. I can only show you. She studied him, searching his face, his eyes. He looked different, not just worn from the trials, but from something deeper. The fire that had once burned with arrogance had dimmed. In its place was something else. Uncertainty, perhaps even regret. But was regret enough? The spirits whispered again, pressing against her skin like the wind before a storm. They would not choose for her. This was her path to decide. Her gaze did not waver as she took a step forward. The space between them felt heavy, filled with everything unsaid. Slowly, she raised her hand, but instead of reaching for him, she touched his chest, right over his heart. The moment stretched, unbroken. Then finally she spoke. I do not know if you will remain the man you are now, she said, her voice steady. I do not know if time will shape you back into the person you once were. He swallowed hard, but he did not look away. But I know this. She exhaled softly. I am not the same woman who stood beside you before. His shoulders tensed as if bracing for what was to come. I will not carry your burden for you, she continued. Your journey is your own. Your redemption is not mine to grant. The spirit stirred. The choice had been made. Her hand fell away, and she stepped back. For the first time, true fear flickered across his face. Not fear of pain, not fear of the trials, but the realization of what he had lost. She turned, walking toward the edge of the sacred valley. The wind carried her forward, away from him, away from the past. She did not look back. If this story made you feel something, shock, anger, or even hope, then don't leave without letting us know. Hit that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Do you think she made the right choice? Would you have forgiven him? We want to hear from you. And if you love powerful, emotional stories like this, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Thank you for watching.